Those rules are what keep you alive out there. Follow them to the letter. No exceptions. That's what Captain Bellamy told me at the dock, pressing a crumpled piece of paper into my hand before I even set foot on the Lila Grace. The marina behind us looked ordinary enough, with its chipped paint and the smell of diesel and fish, but the captain's eyes never left the water. I stared down at the list, trying not to show how uneasy it made me. At first, I thought the rules were just old superstitions, something to humor the crew. That was before the night I heard the whispers call my name from the river. I didn't laugh after that. 5 rules, written on a crumpled piece of paper, stood between me and whatever was out there in the water. I read them twice, then a third time, trying to make sense of them. Instead, I focused on the list itself. 5 rules, each more unsettling than the last, scribbled in rough handwriting that pressed deep into the paper. The first one read, "Never look at the water between 1:30 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. The second, if you hear knocking on the cabin door during those hours, do not answer. The third, if the boat stops moving for no reason, stay calm and keep working. The fourth, if you see a girl in a red coat walking on the water, go below deck immediately. The fifth, if something attacks the boat, hide until it's over." There were no explanations, no background stories, just these 5 lines and a warning at the bottom: no exceptions. Lose this list, and you lose your chance to survive. That last part stuck with me. Captain Bellamy didn't say it to scare me, but the way he pressed the paper into my hand made it clear he meant every word. His voice was flat, almost tired, but his eyes didn't waver. Follow these rules exactly or you don't stand a chance. After that, he turned away and started loading supplies. The rest of the crew kept their distance, moving quietly around the dock, never meeting my eyes for longer than a second or two. I could feel their unease, even if no one said a word about it. On the first day, I tried to act like it was nothing. Just another job. Just another set of instructions to follow. But the rules kept slipping back into my mind, especially when I watched the others. Carter, the oldest crew member, worked with a kind of practiced caution. He never lingered on the deck after sunset, and he always checked the time before stepping outside. At first, I thought it was just habit, but then I noticed how he'd glance at the river, then quickly look away if it was late. The younger deckhands didn't talk much, but I caught them glancing at their watches and moving a little faster as the night crept closer. The rules shaped everything we did. As dusk settled over the river, Bellamy would double-check the engine, making sure we kept moving. No one wanted to be caught drifting when the sun went down. There was a quiet urgency in how the crew worked, like they were racing against something I couldn't see. The first time I heard the engine sputter after dark, Bellamy barked out orders before I could even react. "Don't stop, keep working." His hands never left the controls, and his eyes never strayed to the water. I tried to ask Carter about the rules once, when we were both on deck and the air had that heavy, silent feel. "Do you really believe all that?" I kept my voice low, not wanting to sound nervous. Carter didn't answer right away. He just kept working, then finally said, "The rules are the rules. Doesn't matter what I believe." He didn't offer any more than that, and I didn't push. The way he said it, it wasn't up for discussion. It was just the way things were. As the days went by, I started to notice how the rules seeped into every part of life on the Lila Grace. After midnight, the crew spoke in hushed tones, and no one left the cabin without checking the clock first. The windows were kept covered, and the doors were locked tight. If anyone heard a sound outside, they ignored it. The tension was thickest during those forbidden hours, 1:30 to 4:30 a.m., when even the usual creaks and groans of the boat seemed amplified. I spent a lot of nights lying awake, listening to the river lap against the hull. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at the clock, counting the minutes until it was safe again. I tried to convince myself it was all superstition, that the rules were just an old captain's way of keeping his crew in line. But the longer I stayed, the harder it was to believe that. The fear in the crew's eyes was real. They didn't argue, didn't joke about the rules, and they never forgot them. The fourth rule unsettled me the most. If you see a girl in a red coat walking on the water, go below deck immediately. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a ghost story. But Carter's hands would tremble a little when he checked the locks at night, and the youngest crew member, Mikey, always made sure to draw the curtains tight before midnight. No one ever talked about the girl in the red coat, but the rule hung in the air, unspoken and heavy. The fifth rule felt like the final warning. If something attacks the boat, hide until it's over. Bellamy never explained what something meant, and no one asked. The silence that followed any mention of the rules was more telling than any story could have been. I started to realize it wasn't about believing in monsters or ghosts. It was about surviving, no matter what. There were moments when I almost forgot about the rules, caught up in the routine of work and the endless stretch of the river. But every night, as the clock crept closer to 1:30, I felt the weight of the list in my pocket. I checked the time more often. I avoided the windows. The rules became a kind of rhythm, shaping every decision, every movement. It was easier to follow them than to question them, especially when the crew watched me with that quiet, measured look. Still, doubt crept in. I wondered if the rules were just a test, a way to see if I'd fall in line. Maybe Bellamy wanted to weed out the reckless ones. Maybe the crew was in on it, playing along to keep the peace. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. I'd follow the rules, do the work, and keep my head down until payday. But the river had a way of making you question everything, especially when the night was at its darkest. I never lost the list. I kept it folded in the same pocket every day, checking it whenever I felt the urge to look out at the water or answer a noise I wasn't sure was real. The rules became a kind of lifeline, something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. Bellamy's warning echoed in my mind. Lose this list, and you lose your chance to survive. It didn't take long before I started to wonder what would happen if I broke one. The curiosity was always there, just under the surface. The river was quiet, the boat steady, and the rules felt more like a challenge than a threat. I told myself I was just being careful, just following orders. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before something tested me. The nights grew longer, and the silence pressed in on all sides. The crew moved like shadows, always alert, always careful. I tried to match their caution, but I could feel my resolve slipping. The rules were simple, but the reasons behind them were anything but. I spent hours replaying Bellamy's words, trying to find a crack in his certainty. Eventually, the question became impossible to ignore. What would really happen if I looked at the water during those hours? The thought gnawed at me, restless and sharp, every time I heard the river moving outside. I knew the rules were there for a reason, but I couldn't help wanting to see for myself. The first rule was always the hardest to keep, and the night I decided to test it, everything changed. It started with a ripple, a small, almost unnoticeable shift in the glassy surface of the river. I'd drawn the short straw for night watch, and by 1:45 a.m. the silence had settled in so deep it pressed against my ears. The crew was below deck, doors shut, and even the hum of the engine seemed to fade out during those forbidden hours. The rules said not to look at the water between 1:30 and 4:30, but the logic behind it felt thin in the quiet. I told myself I'd just check the horizon, nothing more, but my eyes slipped down to the river anyway. The air felt thick, colder than it had been all night. I leaned over the rail, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The ripple spread wider, then another joined it, and soon the whole surface looked like something was shifting underneath. I tried to remember what Carter had said about keeping your eyes on deck, but the curiosity was stronger. The ripples widened until the water seemed to pull itself apart, and that's when I saw it. The river opened up, not like a wave or a whirlpool, but like a mouth, an enormous set of teeth, each one the size of the Lila Grace itself, jagged and slick and impossibly white in the moonlight. The mouth didn't rise above the surface. It just formed beneath, water swirling between the teeth, grinding with a deep, thunderous sound that rattled through the hull. I couldn't move. The grinding sound was so real, so close, I felt it in my bones. The teeth shifted, water pouring in and out, and the mouth seemed to breathe with the current. That's when the voices started. They didn't sound like anything human. Dozens of overlapping whispers, some urgent, some pleading, all speaking in languages I didn't understand. The voices wrapped around me, echoing off the deck and the metal rails, and somehow, beneath all that noise, I heard my name. Jonah. Hearing it made my chest tighten. It didn't sound threatening, but it didn't sound familiar either. The voices kept calling, each one a little clearer, weaving in and out of the grinding teeth. I felt myself leaning forward, almost against my will, the pull of the voices stronger than anything I'd ever felt. My fingers dug into the rail, splinters biting into my skin. But I couldn't let go. The urge to answer, to step closer, was overwhelming. It felt like the river itself was trying to draw me in, to make me part of whatever was waiting just below the surface. I tried to look away, but my eyes stayed locked on the mouth. The teeth moved, grinding louder, and the water churned around them, black and cold. The air pressed against me, thick and wet, making it hard to breathe. My heart hammered so loudly I could barely hear the voices, but I knew they were still calling, still trying to get me to answer. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something huge and hungry, and the only thing keeping me from falling in was the rail beneath my hands. Time stretched out. I don't know if it was seconds or minutes, but every part of me felt locked in place. The mouth shifted again, teeth glinting in the moonlight, and for one awful moment I thought it was going to close around the boat. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the mouth collapsed. The water snapped shut, the ripples faded, and the river went still. The voices cut off, leaving only the echo of my name in my head. I stumbled back from the rail, breath coming in short, shallow bursts. My hands shook, sweat running down my back despite the cold. I dropped to my knees on the deck, trying to force air into my lungs, but every breath tasted like river water. The silence pressed in, heavier than before, and I realized I could still hear my name, faint and insistent, tucked somewhere deep in my mind. A few minutes later, Carter found me slumped against the cabin wall. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, then at the water, then back again. His face didn't show surprise or fear, just a kind of recognition. He reached down, pulled me to my feet, and said, "Should have kept your eyes on deck." That was all. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He didn't need to. I could tell by the way he kept his eyes fixed anywhere but the river that he'd been through it before. I followed him below deck, legs barely steady, and tried to calm the shaking in my hands. The rest of the crew pretended not to notice as I passed. They kept their voices low, eyes averted, and I realized how alone I really was out there. The Lila Grace felt smaller after that, the walls closing in, the river outside pressing against the hull. I kept thinking about the mouth, the teeth, the way the water had seemed alive and hungry. The rules weren't superstition. They were the only thing keeping us from whatever waited out there. I spent the rest of that night sitting on my bunk, the list of rules clenched in my fist. Every so often I'd catch myself listening for the voices, half expecting to hear my name again. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it was shallow and restless. When the sun finally rose and the river turned gold in the light, nothing seemed out of place. The water was calm, the boat steady, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. From that night on, I watched the crew more closely. Carter was careful, but it was Bellamy who stood out. The captain didn't just enforce the rules, he lived by them. Every move he made, every order he gave was shaped by a kind of discipline I'd never seen before. I started to wonder what he'd seen out here, what it had cost him to keep everyone alive. The rules weren't just about survival. They were about carrying a burden, one that pressed down on everyone, but especially on Bellamy. Bellamy's presence on the Lila Grace was steady, almost mechanical, but it was the kind of steadiness that came from years of repetition and vigilance. He moved with purpose, every action precise, and he never wasted a word. The crew watched him, and I did too, trying to figure out what kept him so tightly wound. His routines were strict, but what stood out most was how he disappeared below deck every night at exactly 1:30 a.m. and didn't come back up until 4:30. He never missed a night, not once in the week I'd been on board. When he returned, his eyes were rimmed with shadows, and his shoulders looked heavier than before. It was more than just being tired. It was a kind of exhaustion that seemed to come from fighting something no one else could see. I started to notice how the rest of the crew fell in line with his discipline. There was no debate, no questioning the orders he gave, especially as the forbidden hours approached. The tension in the air always got thicker after midnight, and Bellamy's absence during those hours only made it worse. The younger deckhands would glance at the clock and at each other, but no one ever asked where he went or why he stayed away from the main cabin. Carter, who'd been with Bellamy the longest, just told me, "That's the captain's time. You don't want to know." It wasn't a warning so much as a fact, like telling someone not to touch a hot stove. Bellamy's authority was never in question, but it was his strict adherence to the rules that set the tone for everything. He didn't just enforce them, he embodied them. If the sun started to dip and we were behind on a task, he'd stop everything and order us to move below deck or double-check the locks. Once, when Mikey hesitated near the rail as dusk settled in, Bellamy grabbed him by the collar and hauled him back, not saying a word. His jaw was clenched, and he kept his eyes fixed on the water like he was waiting for something to surface. It wasn't anger or panic in his face, just a grim acceptance, like this was the price of doing things right. I tried to understand where that certainty came from. The answer came one night when the fog was thick and the deck lights barely reached the end of the bow. I caught Bellamy alone at the wheel and asked why he was so strict about the rules. He stood silent for a long moment, hands gripping the wheel, then finally spoke. "You think I follow these rules because I want to?" he said, his voice low. "I follow them because I've seen what happens when you don't." He told me about his old captain, Hank Dorsey, a man who'd fished these waters for 30 years and never lost a single crew member. Dorsey had passed the rules down to Bellamy, word for word, and made him promise to follow them to the letter. "That's how you keep people alive out here," Bellamy said. "Not by luck, not by chance, by listening to the ones who came before." There was a finality in his tone that told me the conversation was over. He didn't offer more, and I didn't ask, but the story stuck with me. Bellamy wasn't just enforcing tradition. He was carrying on a survival guide handed down over decades. The stakes were real. Bellamy once mentioned, almost in passing, that the Coast Guard had found 11 abandoned vessels in these waters over the years. No bodies, no distress calls, just empty boats drifting until someone found them. He didn't linger on the details, but the implication was clear. Whatever haunted this stretch of river wasn't just a story to scare new crew, it was a threat that had claimed entire boats. Bellamy's discipline wasn't paranoia. It was a response to something that had happened before and could happen again. His nightly ritual took on a new meaning after that. Every night, as the clock ticked toward 1:30, Bellamy would check his watch, say nothing, and slip away below deck. The rest of us would stay in the main cabin, doors locked, curtains drawn, speaking only in whispers if at all. When Bellamy returned at 4:30, he looked like he'd been through a war. His face was drawn, and his hands shook just enough that you'd notice if you were watching closely. He never talked about what he did during those hours, and no one pressed him for answers. The unspoken rule was that whatever he faced, it was his alone. Sometimes, in the quiet after his return, I'd catch him staring out at the water, eyes distant, as if replaying something only he could see. The weight he carried was visible in the way he stood, shoulders hunched and head bowed, not from defeat, but from the effort of holding the line. I realized then that the rules weren't just about keeping us safe. They were a way for Bellamy to honor the promise he'd made to Dorsey, to keep the crew alive no matter what. It was a responsibility that didn't end when the sun came up or the catch was hauled in. The crew respected him, but there was a distance too. No one got close. Not really. His authority was absolute, but it was built on a foundation of fear and necessity, not camaraderie. The rules shaped every part of life on the Lila Grace, from the way we worked to the way we slept. Bellamy's vigilance set the pace, and we followed because the alternative was unthinkable. I started to see that his burden wasn't just the rules themselves. It was the memory of what could happen if they were broken. I thought about the abandoned boats, the missing crews, and the way Bellamy's hands trembled after those long nights. He never spoke about what he'd seen, but the evidence was in every measured movement and every order he gave. The discipline he demanded wasn't about control. It was about survival, passed down from one captain to the next. The burden wasn't just his to carry, but he shouldered it for all of us. As the days blurred together and the nights grew longer, the sense of unease on the boat deepened. The rules became more than just guidelines. They were the only thing standing between us and the river's secrets. Bellamy's example kept us sharp, but it also reminded us how thin the line was between order and chaos out there. I found myself checking the clock more often, listening for sounds I couldn't explain, and holding tighter to the list in my pocket. We all knew something could go wrong at any moment. Bellamy's routines, his warnings, and the stories he left unfinished were reminders that the rules didn't guarantee safety. They only gave us a fighting chance. The night we learned just how fragile that chance was started like any other, with the hum of the engine and the river sliding by in the dark. But it didn't end that way. It was the kind of night that made you wish for daylight. Rain hammered the deck in steady sheets, beating against the windows and drowning out most other sounds. After dinner, Carter and I lingered in the galley, the overhead light flickering while we picked at the last of our food. The rest of the crew moved quietly, voices low, as if the storm outside might hear them. Bellamy checked his watch, then disappeared below deck at his usual hour, leaving us with the uneasy ritual of waiting out the storm. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The boat rocked in the current, the hull creaking with each swell. I watched the clock, counting down the minutes until Bellamy would reappear, but the minutes stretched on. Carter and I finished cleaning up, the silence between us thick. The rain hadn't let up. If anything, it grew heavier, drumming against the portholes in a relentless rhythm. I wiped down the counter, trying not to think about the rules or the way the storm seemed to press against the boat from all sides. Then, without warning, the boat stopped moving. Not a jolt, not a shudder, just a sudden stillness, as if the river had decided to hold us in place. The engine still hummed in the background, but the hull refused to drift, locked in position in spite of the current. I glanced at Carter, and he looked back at me, eyes wide, both of us understanding what that meant. Rule 3. If the boat stops moving for no reason, stay calm and keep working. It sounded simple on paper, but in that moment, calm was the last thing I felt. We stood there waiting. The rain battered the roof and the lights flickered again. The storm outside made it hard to hear anything else, but then the whispers returned. Soft at first, barely more than the suggestion of voices. I tried to focus on the dishes, but every time I looked up, the clock seemed to move slower. 10 minutes stretched out. The boat held fast, as if something in the river had wrapped itself around us and refused to let go. Then Carter's hand froze on the sink. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I listened. The whispers grew louder, threading through the sound of the rain. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing in the metal walls and the glass of the portholes. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air felt close, thick with the kind of fear that makes your skin itch. The lights dimmed again, and for a moment, the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. That's when the boat lurched, just enough to make the plates rattle in the cupboards. The hull shuddered, then settled. The whispers faded, replaced by something stranger, a tapping, soft at first, then more insistent, moving from one porthole to the next. Carter and I looked at each other, neither of us willing to move closer. The tapping circled the cabin, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like someone walking the perimeter of the boat. I moved to the window, careful not to get too close. The rain made it hard to see, but then I caught a flash of red outside. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the storm, but there she was, a girl, no older than 10, standing on the river just beyond the rail. Her coat was a bright, impossible red, and even in the downpour, she was perfectly dry. She didn't move, didn't shiver, just stood there, watching the boat with a blank, empty stare. My stomach twisted. I remembered the 4th rule. If you see a girl in a red coat walking on the water, go below deck immediately. Carter saw her too. His face went pale, and he stepped back, nearly stumbling over a chair. The tapping grew louder, now joined by faint, wet footprints appearing on the deck outside the portholes. The girl took a single step toward us, her feet leaving no mark on the water. But the footprints kept appearing, one after another, circling the boat. Bellamy's voice echoed up from the stairwell. "Below deck, now!" He didn't shout, but the urgency in his voice cut through everything else. Carter snapped out of his trance first, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the hatch. The rest of the crew was already moving, their faces drawn and silent as they filed past. I hesitated, glancing back at the window. The girl's eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, her mouth a thin, unmoving line. We scrambled down the steps, Bellamy slamming the hatch behind us. The tapping followed, now on the metal above our heads. The galley felt even smaller with all of us crammed inside, the air thick with fear and the smell of wet clothing. The lights flickered again, and in the brief flashes of darkness, I could hear the whispers rising, weaving in and out of the tapping, threading through every thought in my head. No one spoke. The only sounds were the storm above and the relentless tapping that moved from hatch to porthole and back again. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to remember the rules, trying to hold on to something solid. Bellamy stood by the hatch, one hand on the metal, eyes closed, as if he could will the danger away by sheer force. The assault came next, a series of heavy thuds, as if something massive was slamming itself against the hull. With each impact, the boat shivered, the lights threatening to go out for good. The tapping never stopped, and now the whispers seemed to crawl under my skin, each word a needle. I caught fragments of my name, twisted and stretched by voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. The storm outside masked most of the noise, but I could still hear the scratching, long, slow drags of something sharp across the hull. Carter sat on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees, rocking slightly. The others stood, gripping the rails, eyes wide and fixed on nothing. Bellamy's face was set, jaw clenched, but his hands trembled just enough to show he was holding on by a thread. The minutes crawled by. The boat stayed locked in place, every thud and scrape a reminder of what waited just beyond the walls. I tried to focus on the rules, repeating them in my head, but the fear was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. I kept thinking about the footprints, the dry red coat, the way the girl's eyes never left mine. Then, as suddenly as it began, the pressure eased. The tapping stopped. The whispers faded, replaced by the steady hiss of rain against the deck. The boat shuddered once more, then drifted free, the current tugging us forward as if nothing had happened. The lights steadied. The engine's hum returned to normal. Bellamy waited a full minute before opening the hatch. We climbed out in silence, the storm finally starting to break, the sky lightening at the edges. The deck was littered with water, but no sign of the girl remained. Only the footprints, impossibly dry in the middle of the wet boards, circled the rail before vanishing at the stern. No one spoke as we cleaned up the mess. The rules had held, but the cost was written on every face. I didn't sleep that morning. I sat by the window, watching the river slide past, the list of rules clutched in my fist. Something in me had changed. The danger wasn't just a story anymore. It was real, and it was waiting. That morning, for the first time since stepping onto the Lila Grace, I felt the rules settle into my bones. Not as superstition, not as someone else's burden, but as something I needed to carry for myself. I stood at the rail, watching the crew move through their routines, and realized the rules weren't arbitrary. They were the only reason any of us were still alive. The memory of the girl in the red coat, the pounding on the hull, and the suffocating fear of being trapped while the river itself pressed against us. Those things were no longer distant threats. They were woven into every decision I made after that night. The crew didn't talk about what happened. Carter's usual jokes were gone. He worked in silence, his hands steady, but his eyes distant. Bellamy moved through his checks with a kind of mechanical focus, never lingering in one spot for long. Even Mikey, who always seemed half a step behind, worked with a new caution. There was no need to speak about what we'd all seen. The tension was obvious in the way we avoided each other's eyes, and the way each of us checked the clock more often than before. I felt it in the heaviness of my own limbs, in the way my hands shook when I tied knots or cleaned the deck. But underneath that exhaustion, something else had taken root. Respect. I kept the list of rules in my pocket, folded and worn from being checked so many times. Bellamy had warned me when I first came aboard, lose the paper, and you lose your chance to survive. That idea stuck with me. I started to recite the rules from memory, not out of paranoia, but because I knew how quickly things could go wrong. The act of memorizing them became a small comfort, a way to keep fear at bay. I would repeat them under my breath as I worked. Never look at the water between 1:30 and 4:30. Don't answer if you hear knocking. Keep working if the boat stops. Go below deck if you see the girl in red. Hide if something attacks. Each line was a lifeline, a promise that if I followed them exactly, I might make it through another night. It was clear now that the rules were more than just a set of instructions. They were a discipline, a structure that kept panic from taking over when things got bad. I watched the others and saw the same pattern in them. When the sun went down, everyone moved with purpose. No one wasted time, and no one questioned the routine. The smallest details mattered. Locking the hatch, covering the windows, counting the minutes until Bellamy returned from below deck. There was comfort in the repetition, in knowing that every action had a reason. I found myself changing in small ways. Where I once rolled my eyes at the rules or tried to joke about them with Carter, I now double-checked every line and every latch. I started to anticipate what needed to be done before Bellamy or Carter could say anything. The fear that had nearly broken me was still there, but it was sharper now, more focused. Instead of letting it control me, I used it to keep myself alert. The rules weren't a cage. They were the only thing standing between us and whatever waited outside. Bellamy noticed the shift. He didn't say much, but I caught him watching me as I moved through the evening routine. There was a kind of approval in the way he nodded when I checked the deck, or when I reminded Mikey to stay away from the rail after dark. It wasn't praise, not really, but it was enough to know I was doing things right. I understood now why Bellamy and Carter never hesitated to enforce the rules. They weren't trying to scare anyone. They were trying to keep us alive. The days after that night blurred together. Each one started with the same exhaustion and ended with the same careful preparation. I learned to read the river, not just its surface, but the way the air felt before a storm, the way the current changed when something was near. I stopped questioning the rules and started to trust them. The skepticism that had followed me onto the boat was gone. In its place was a kind of quiet determination. I wanted to prove to the crew and to myself that I could be trusted to do what was necessary. I saw the same transformation in the others. Carter, who had once teased me for being green, now nodded when I took initiative. Mikey watched and copied my movements, learning the rhythm of the boat without a word. Even Bellamy seemed to relax, if only a little, as we moved through the routines together. There was a sense of belonging in that shared discipline, a silent understanding that we were all in this together. The more I followed the rules, the more I understood their purpose. They weren't about control or tradition. They were about survival in a place where the usual logic didn't apply. The river didn't care if you believed in its dangers. It only cared if you respected them. Every time I thought about what might have happened if we'd ignored the rules that night, my stomach tightened. The cost of a single mistake was too high. I started to think less about why the rules worked and more about making sure I never missed a step. It wasn't about understanding the threats outside. It was about trusting the experience of those who'd survived before me. Bellamy's old captain had passed the rules down for a reason, and now I understood why. There was no room for pride or stubbornness out here, only discipline. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if I ever left the Lila Grace, if the rules would follow me back to shore. But out on the river, they were all that mattered. The crew never spoke of the things we'd seen, and I learned not to ask. Some questions didn't have answers, and some dangers couldn't be named. The rules were enough. By the end of that week, I moved with the same caution and purpose as the rest of the crew. The fear was still there, but it didn't paralyze me anymore. It kept me sharp. I checked the list in my pocket less often, not because I needed it less, but because I knew every word by heart. The transformation was complete. I was no longer an outsider. I was part of the crew, and the rules were part of me. Looking back, I realized that discipline wasn't just about following orders. It was about accepting that some things are bigger than you, and that survival depends on respecting what you can't control. The rules had saved us, but they had also changed us. And as I stood on the deck, watching the river slide past under the fading light, I knew I would never see the world the same way again. That's what it means to live by rules that matter. When I first stepped onto the Lila Grace, I was desperate for work and convinced the rules were just a leftover superstition. I didn't realize I was stepping into a legacy, 30 years of crews surviving these waters because they followed the same rules, passed down from Bellamy's old captain. After that final storm, I understood why. I'd made the shift from skeptic to survivor, and I knew I was part of something that kept us alive when so many others disappeared without a trace. Looking back, I can't separate my survival from those rules. They were strict, sometimes strange, but they worked. I memorized every line because I knew losing that list meant losing my chance. It's easy to underestimate rules until you see what happens when they're ignored. Have you ever dismissed a rule or warning only to realize later it was what kept you safe? Share your story in the comments. I want to know what hidden dangers you've learned to respect.